What happens when a ruthless gang targets a small-town cafe owner, thinking she's an easy mark, only to discover she's a former Navy SEAL? Emma Walters, a single mother, must confront her past and use her training to defend her cafe and community, uncovering a deeper, more dangerous threat lurking beneath the surface. In the small town of Clearwater, the Corner Café had long been a refuge, a welcoming spot for locals to gather and escape the grind of daily life. For Emma Walters, it was more than just a business. It was a piece of her past, a place she had built after leaving her life as a decorated Navy SEAL behind. She had swapped missions in war-torn regions for steaming mugs of coffee and freshly baked pastries. The cafe was her sanctuary, a way to maintain a semblance of peace after years spent in chaos. Emma's life had always been about protecting others, whether it was her fellow soldiers in combat or, more recently, her young daughter, Sophia. Sophia, only 9 years old, was the light of Emma's life. Her infectious laughter and unshakable optimism filled the cafe each day as she helped her mom out with simple tasks or sat quietly at a table, sketching in her little notebook. Emma adored every second of it. Sophia was her reason for building this peaceful life, and she would protect it at all costs. Running the cafe in Clearwater wasn't without its challenges, but Emma was a fighter. It was her way of contributing to the town, giving back to the community that had supported her over the years. The cafe had become more than just a business. It was a gathering place for everyone in town, especially those who felt out of place in a world that didn't always understand them. People from all backgrounds came to the cafe, finding solace in its walls and in the warmth of Emma's hospitality. But over the past few months, something in the town had started to shift. The once calm streets of Clearwater were now laced with an undercurrent of tension. Emma had noticed it in the way people looked over their shoulders, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room. She had heard rumors about a gang moving into town, but at first she had brushed it off. She was too busy to pay attention to rumors. But the graffiti on the side of her cafe, the way some customers had started to avoid coming in after dark, was a sign that something more serious was afoot. One morning, as the early light filtered through the cafe windows, Emma stood behind the counter preparing her usual morning coffee. The soft hum of the espresso machine was a comfort to her, the warm smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. She looked up as the bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of yet another customer. But this time, something was different. As she turned to greet the new arrival, Emma's sharp eyes caught a glimpse of 3 figures standing across the street. They were men, tall, intimidating, and standing a little too still. They were loitering outside the old bookstore, an area that had been empty for years, and Emma couldn't help but feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She quickly turned her attention back to the counter, but the unease lingered in her gut. She couldn't shake the feeling. Her instincts, honed from years of military service, were on high alert. She didn't like the way the men were standing, too deliberate in their body language, too focused on her cafe. Emma had seen this before. She knew that the gang that had been causing trouble in the town had made it their mission to intimidate small business owners, to get them to either pay up or close their doors. It was all too familiar, and Emma wasn't about to let it happen here. The bell above the door chimed again, and Emma looked up to see the 3 men stepping inside. Their heavy boots echoed against the hardwood floor as they spread out, their eyes scanning the room like predators. Emma's first instinct was to grab her phone, but she forced herself to stay calm. No need to escalate the situation just yet. She stood behind the counter, offering her warmest smile, even as her mind began to calculate the best way to handle what was coming. She'd been in tense situations before. She could handle this. "Nice place you got here," the tallest man said, his voice low and rough. He glanced around the cafe, taking in the mismatched furniture, the eclectic decor, the peaceful atmosphere that had always defined the space. His eyes flicked briefly to the customers sitting at their tables, all of them visibly tense but trying to ignore the intrusion. Emma met his gaze with a smile. "Thank you," she said evenly. "Can I get you something to drink or eat?" The man's smirk deepened, his eyes narrowing as he leaned casually against the counter. "We're just here to look around," he said, his tone laced with something dangerous beneath the surface. Emma's fingers lightly brushed the edge of the counter, where her phone rested, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she stood tall, keeping her posture relaxed, her hands visible. "Feel free," she said. "Let me know if you need anything." The man exchanged a glance with his companions, who were still moving around the cafe, their eyes scanning the room. Emma could see the way they were trying to take control of the space, asserting their presence, intimidating the patrons with nothing more than their posture. It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. Conversations had ceased, and the air felt thick with tension. No one dared speak up. The tall man straightened and took a step forward, his eyes still on Emma. "You got a name for this place?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Or should we just call it a community project?" Emma didn't flinch. Her smile remained steady, though her mind was already racing. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest. She had dealt with pressure before, but it was never quite like this. Never quite so personal, but she wasn't about to back down now. "It's called the Corner Café," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And everyone's welcome here." The man chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. He glanced around at the other patrons, some of whom had already started to fidget in their seats, trying to avoid eye contact. The tension in the room was palpable, and Emma knew the men could sense it, but she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her nervous. "Well, that's cute," the man said, his grin widening. "I gotta admit, this place has got a certain charm. A little too much of it, maybe." Emma kept her cool, her mind focused on the task at hand. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steady. "If you're here to order something, the menu's right there," she said, gesturing toward the board behind the counter. "If not, I'll have to ask you to leave." The man's expression faltered for a brief moment before his smirk returned. "We're not here to order," he said, his tone darkening. "We're here for something else. But don't worry, we'll leave when we're done." Emma's heart rate increased just slightly, but she didn't let it show. She knew the game they were playing, and she wasn't about to play into their hands. She stayed calm, her body language relaxed, her stance open, but her mind was already calculating the next move. "You're welcome to stay," Emma said, her voice even, "but only if you respect the people around you." She didn't know how long this was going to last, but Emma Walters was no stranger to danger, and this time, she wasn't going to let anyone take what was hers. The cafe was silent, save for the clinking of cups and the low hum of the espresso machine. The three men had spread out across the room, and Emma's gaze never left them, even as she continued with the task at hand. Her sharp mind was already calculating her options, analyzing every move they made. She could feel the weight of their presence in the air, but she wasn't going to let them rattle her. One of the men, a stocky figure with a neck tattoo that snaked up the side of his face, leaned against the counter, his eyes scanning the room. He looked out of place in the cozy setting, like a predator waiting to pounce. Emma noticed the way his gaze lingered on the other customers, making them visibly uncomfortable, but no one dared to speak up. The tension in the room was thick, palpable. The once bustling cafe now felt like a powder keg, just waiting to explode. Emma was aware of every detail in the room, the way the light flickered from the old chandelier above, the clinking of silverware, the faint smell of burnt coffee in the air. Everything seemed to slow down as her mind processed the situation. She had dealt with violent men before, but this felt different. There was something deliberate about their presence. They weren't just here for the coffee, and they certainly weren't just here to chat. The tall man, who had been the one to speak earlier, stepped closer to the counter, his eyes fixed on Emma. He was testing her, pushing her boundaries. She could tell by the way he kept his hands in his pockets, the casual way he spoke. But Emma wasn't fooled. The situation had escalated far beyond a casual visit, and she knew it. She had been around violence enough to recognize the signs. These men weren't here for a friendly conversation. They were here to intimidate, to control. "You know," the tall man began, his voice smooth but with an underlying edge. "This place, it's cute, real cute, but it's not exactly what I'd expect from a cafe in a town like this." Emma didn't flinch. "Everyone's welcome here," she said simply, her tone steady. "And everyone's treated with respect." The man's eyes narrowed slightly as if he was evaluating her. For a moment, there was a flicker of something, perhaps surprise, that crossed his face. He was used to people being intimidated by his presence. But Emma wasn't like everyone else. She had spent years in situations far worse than this, and she wasn't about to let him, or anyone, take what was hers without a fight. "So tell me," the man said, his voice dropping an octave lower, "how do you think this is going to end?" Emma stood tall, her hands still resting on the counter, fingers barely brushing the edge of her phone. "I'm not sure what you mean," she replied calmly, her expression neutral, but her mind working in overdrive. "But if you're looking for trouble, you're in the wrong place." The man chuckled, a low sound that sent a chill through the room. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh that came from someone who had seen too much, done too much. "We don't need trouble," he said. "We just need to make sure everyone knows who's in charge." Emma's grip on the counter tightened just slightly. She was about to respond, but the stocky man by the window cut in. He was watching the room, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. "You know, you've got a real nice place here," he said almost too casually. "But it's not gonna stay that way if you keep turning people away." Emma wasn't fooled by his tone. She could tell he was trying to provoke her, trying to get a rise out of her. But Emma had been trained for this. She had learned long ago that the best way to disarm an opponent was not through force, but through calm and control. She didn't need to engage in their games. She wasn't going to let them think they had the upper hand. "You don't have to worry about that," she said evenly. "But if you're not here to order anything, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The stocky man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of friendliness. It was a smile that held menace, one that suggested he was about to push her further. "Oh, I think we'll stay for a little while longer," he said, stepping closer to the counter. "You've got a real cozy place here. Might be a shame if something happened to it." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for the first time since they'd walked in, Emma felt a shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just about her cafe anymore. It wasn't just about them causing trouble. This was a clear threat. They were trying to intimidate her, to make her feel powerless. But Emma wasn't about to let that happen. She straightened her back, her posture solid and unyielding. She had spent too many years building this cafe, too many years working to create a safe space for people in Clearwater. She wasn't going to let a bunch of thugs tear it down, not without a fight. "I don't need your kind of help," she said, her voice low but firm. "And I won't be intimidated by you." The tall man's smirk faded for a moment, replaced by a glimmer of frustration. It was brief, but Emma saw it. The power dynamic was shifting, and he didn't like it. "You sure about that?" he said, his voice colder now. "Because if you keep pushing, things are gonna get real ugly, real fast." Emma's eyes locked onto his, her expression hardening. She had dealt with worse than threats. She had faced down enemies who wanted to destroy her, who thought they could take everything from her, but Emma had survived, and she wasn't about to let this gang break her. "I've been through worse than this," she said quietly, her voice like steel. "So if you think I'm going to back down, you're wrong. Now, if you're not here to order, I need you to leave." The tension in the cafe reached its peak, and Emma could feel every pair of eyes on her. The room was still, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The tall man stared at her for a long moment, his gaze narrowing. Then slowly, he straightened up, as if weighing his options. "Well, maybe we'll just have to take a rain check," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But we'll be back. You can count on it." Without another word, the three men turned and walked toward the door, their boots clicking against the wooden floor. Emma's heart was pounding in her chest, but she didn't let it show. As the door slammed behind them, the cafe exhaled collectively, as if the room had just been holding its breath. Emma stood there for a moment, her eyes scanning the room, making sure the men were really gone. When she was sure, she let out a quiet sigh, though her mind was still racing. She hadn't won yet. This wasn't over. The gang was still out there, and they would be back. Emma knew she had to be ready. The cafe seemed quieter after the three men left, the oppressive tension lifting ever so slightly, but it didn't fully dissipate. Emma could still feel the weight of their presence, the lingering threat in the air. She turned her attention back to the counter, running her fingers lightly over the polished wood as her thoughts raced. She knew this wasn't over. The men would be back, and next time, they wouldn't be so easily deterred. "Are you all right?" a voice asked softly, pulling Emma from her thoughts. It was Maya, one of her regulars, a teacher at the local high school who often came by for her morning coffee. Maya had been a longtime supporter of the cafe, a kind and gentle woman who had become one of Emma's closest friends in Clearwater. Emma hadn't seen her in the chaos that had just unfolded, but now she saw the concern in Maya's eyes. "I'm fine," Emma said, forcing a smile, though her voice betrayed the unease that still lingered. She hadn't shaken off the fear from the confrontation. Not yet. Just a little shaken, that's all. Maya didn't seem convinced, her eyes flicking toward the door as though she was still expecting the men to return at any moment. "You're sure? They won't come back, right?" Emma hesitated for a moment, trying to read Maya's face. She could see the genuine worry there. Maya, like most of the town, had no idea about Emma's past, about the life she had left behind when she settled in Clearwater with Sophia. No one in the town knew that Emma had been a Navy SEAL, that she had fought in some of the world's most dangerous places, that she had survived situations far worse than the one she'd just faced. She wasn't sure how to explain it to Maya without revealing too much. She wasn't ready to expose that part of her life just yet. She had worked hard to build a new, quiet life. "I'll be all right," Emma said, her voice steadier now. "They're just trying to intimidate me, but I won't let them." Maya nodded, though she still looked worried. "Just be careful, Emma. If they come back, let me know. I don't care if I have to call the cops or get the whole town involved." Emma smiled again, this time more genuinely. She appreciated Maya's concern, but she knew she had to handle this on her own. "I will," she promised. The door chimed again, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she thought the men had returned, but it was just David, the local mechanic, walking in for his usual afternoon coffee. He waved at Emma with a friendly smile, completely unaware of what had just transpired. "Afternoon, Emma," David called, taking his usual seat by the window. "Looks like things have quieted down a bit, huh?" Emma forced herself to return his smile, though her mind was still reeling from the confrontation. "Afternoon, David," she replied. "Yeah, just another day." David didn't seem to notice the tension in the room. He was the type of person who could easily go about his day, oblivious to the darker things happening around him. But Emma couldn't afford that luxury. She had a daughter to protect, a cafe to defend, and a fight that was just beginning. As she went about preparing David's coffee, Emma's mind kept drifting back to the men who had walked into her cafe. She had seen the way they looked at the other patrons, the way they scanned the room, sizing everyone up. They were trying to send a message to establish dominance over her business. Emma had seen gangs like this before, men who thought they could get away with anything because they were used to people cowering in fear. But Emma wasn't like the others. She had faced much worse and survived. She wasn't about to let them take control of her life without a fight. After serving David his coffee, Emma moved to the back of the cafe where she could think more clearly. She didn't have much time to prepare. The next confrontation was coming, and this time she had to be ready. The evening rolled in slowly, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting long shadows over the town. Emma knew it was only a matter of time before the gang returned, so she spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the cafe as best as she could. She checked all the locks on the doors, made sure the windows were secure, and even positioned a few chairs near the exit just in case she needed a quick escape. Her mind was constantly calculating, her every move deliberate. Sophia had gone to stay with Emma's sister Rachel for the night, and though Emma had insisted it was just a small break, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was the right decision. Sophia had been asking questions about the men who had come into the cafe, her innocent curiosity forcing Emma to keep things light, not wanting her daughter to know the full extent of the danger. She wasn't ready to expose her to that yet. As the day turned into night, Emma found herself walking to the back door, looking out onto the quiet street. She had always loved this part of town, the way the trees lined the sidewalks, the soft glow of the streetlights, the sense of peace that had always been so reassuring. But tonight, something felt off. She stepped back inside, locking the door behind her, and began preparing to close the cafe. But the uneasy feeling in her chest only intensified when she heard a noise from outside. It was subtle, but it was enough to make her freeze in place. Someone was out there, watching. Emma's hand instinctively reached for her phone. It wasn't that she thought she would need it just yet, but there was a gut feeling that something wasn't right. Her instincts told her to be prepared. Just then, the door chimes again, but this time, it wasn't the usual sound of a customer. The door slammed open with force, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. She turned toward the sound, and her breath caught in her throat when she saw him. The tall man from earlier, the one who had been leading the group, stood in the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on her. Behind him, the two other men followed, their postures even more threatening than before. Emma's grip tightened on her phone, but she didn't move. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. "We're back," the tall man said with a grin, his voice laced with menace. "You didn't think we'd just walk away, did you?" Emma's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was her cafe, her community, and she wasn't going to let anyone tear it down. The air in the cafe grew thick, the tension palpable as the men slowly made their way further inside, blocking the entrance. The usual warmth of the cafe seemed to shrink under their presence, replaced by something much darker. Emma stood still, her body poised as she took in every detail of the situation. She couldn't afford to show fear. Not now. She had to stay calm, or else everything she had worked for would come crashing down. The tall man, still grinning, made his way across the floor, his boots echoing in the quiet room. His eyes scanned the surroundings, lingering just a little too long on the art on the walls, the mismatched furniture, the eclectic decor that made the cafe feel like home for everyone who stepped through its doors. The look in his eyes said it all. He didn't just want the cafe, he wanted to break it. He wanted to make her feel like she didn't belong here anymore. "You know," he said, his voice low but loud enough to carry through the tense silence, "this little place, it's got a lot of charm, but see, that's the problem." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, his gaze turning cold as it met hers. "People like you shouldn't be trying to be something they're not. You're just a woman running a cafe. You don't get to play with the big boys." Emma's heart raced, but she didn't let her hands shake. Instead, she straightened her back and looked him squarely in the eyes. She had spent too many years running from the worst parts of herself, hiding behind a peaceful exterior. But the moment had arrived, and she couldn't hide anymore. It was time to confront the past she had worked so hard to bury. "I don't need your kind of help," she said calmly, her voice steady, "and I don't care what you think you're entitled to. This is my place, and I won't let you tear it down." The man's grin faltered for a split second, his arrogance cracking under her steady resolve. But it quickly returned, darker now, as if the small shift in power had stirred something much worse in him. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, and Emma could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical presence. "You think you can stand up to me?" he said, his voice low and mocking, though the edge was sharper now. "You think this place is safe from us? From what we can do?" Emma's grip tightened on the counter, her fingers brushing the edge of the worn wood as she weighed her options. She knew what this man was trying to do. He was trying to break her spirit, make her doubt herself. It was a tactic she had seen used 1,000 times in the field. But the truth was, he was dealing with someone who wasn't afraid of him, someone who had faced worse threats and come out on the other side stronger. "I'm not afraid of you," Emma said firmly. "And if you think you can intimidate me, you're mistaken. I've faced real danger before. This is nothing compared to what I've been through." The man's eyes narrowed, clearly taken aback by her response. For a brief moment, he seemed to lose his footing, unsure of how to proceed. But then his smirk returned, albeit with a more venomous twist. He wasn't going to back down. He never had. "You'll change your mind," he said, his tone darkening with each word. "People like you always do. We've been watching this town, watching you. This place isn't gonna last if you keep defying us, and neither will you." The words were laced with a threat so chilling, it sent a ripple through the room. But Emma didn't back down. She couldn't. Not with Sophia's future on the line, not with the safety of her community at risk. "Leave now," Emma said, her voice commanding, the words almost a whisper but carrying enough authority to make everyone in the room freeze. "Or I'll make you." The silence that followed was deafening. The other men exchanged uncertain glances, but the tall man didn't move. He seemed almost amused by her threat, his expression twisted into something between disbelief and disgust. "You think you can make us leave?" he scoffed, a derisive laugh escaping his lips. "You're just a woman, a cafe owner. And we're the ones in control here." Emma's mind was racing, her senses on high alert. She had no intention of backing down, not in front of the people who depended on her, not in front of her daughter, whose innocence she would protect at all costs. But there was something in the air now, something electric, that made her aware of just how much she was up against. These men weren't going to give up easily. Without warning, the man lunged forward, a glint of malice in his eyes. He grabbed her arm with brutal force, trying to pull her toward him, but Emma's instincts kicked in immediately. Years of training, of facing down threats head-on, surged through her veins. With a fluid motion, she twisted her body, using the momentum against him. She dropped low, shifting her weight to break free from his grip. The tall man staggered back, thrown off balance by the sudden movement, but Emma didn't wait for him to recover. She reached for the edge of a nearby chair, grabbing it and swinging it toward him. He barely had time to react before the back of the chair slammed into his chest, knocking him backward. The cafe was chaos now, the other patrons standing frozen, too afraid to move or speak. The once peaceful space had turned into a battleground, with Emma at its center, her resolve unwavering. But the men weren't done yet. "Get her!" the tall man snarled, his voice laced with fury. "She's not walking away from this." The two men rushed toward Emma, their movements quick and calculated, but Emma was faster. She sidestepped the first one, using his own force to throw him off balance. He collided with the wall with a grunt, and before he could recover, Emma grabbed a ceramic pitcher from the counter, swinging it with all her might. The impact sent him reeling back, clutching his chest as he gasped for air. But the tall man wasn't finished. He was charging at her again, his fists raised, his face twisted in rage. Emma had no choice but to meet him head-on. The tall man lunged at Emma with a snarl, his fists swinging wildly. He was desperate now, his arrogance replaced by frustration as he tried to land a blow, each strike more erratic than the last. Emma could feel the adrenaline surge through her, but her training kept her focused. She wasn't going to let him or anyone intimidate her into submission. She sidestepped his first punch with ease, her body moving fluidly, and then, before he could recover, she struck. Her elbow connected sharply with his side, and he let out a grunt of pain, stumbling back. But it wasn't enough. He recovered quickly, his hands reaching for her again, his movements desperate and savage. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, but her mind was steady. She could see the openings, the ways she could defeat him. Her breathing was calm, controlled, as she readied herself for the next move. The tall man came at her again, but this time she was ready. She ducked low, avoiding his attack, and in a swift movement, grabbed the nearest object, a small metal tray, and swung it at him. The sharp clang of metal connecting with his shoulder sent him staggering back, knocking the wind out of him. The other two men, now clearly more hesitant, began to close in on her. One of them, the stocky man with the neck tattoo, grabbed a chair, lifting it above his head as though planning to strike. But Emma was already moving. She grabbed another chair from behind her and swung it at the man, knocking it out of his hands with a loud crash. The force of the impact sent the man reeling, but before he could recover, she kicked the chair toward him, sending him tumbling backward. He hit the ground with a thud, groaning in pain. The third man, the one who had been watching the room with a cold, calculating gaze, hesitated for a split second. His eyes flicked between Emma and his fallen comrades, uncertainty flashing across his face. But Emma could see the fear behind it. He wasn't sure if they could take her down. And in that brief moment of hesitation, she took control. Without waiting for him to make a move, she stepped forward, grabbing a heavy ceramic mug from the counter and throwing it at his face with pinpoint accuracy. The mug smashed against his cheek, sending him stumbling backward, dazed. He reached up to touch the blood starting to trickle down his face, his expression twisted in pain. The cafe was now in chaos. Customers had started to sneak out, their faces pale, their feet shuffling as they tried to avoid drawing attention. The once peaceful space was now an arena, with Emma at its center, fighting not just for her cafe, but for the safety of her daughter and the future she had built here in Clearwater. "You think you can just walk away from this?" The tall man spat, his anger boiling over. He wiped the blood from his mouth and advanced on Emma once again, his movements wild. "I already told you," Emma said, her voice cold but filled with undeniable authority. "You don't belong here, and you're not going to take this place from me." With a final roar, the tall man charged at her, but this time Emma didn't move. She stood her ground, her body poised and ready. As he got within arm's reach, she ducked and swept his legs out from under him with a sharp, precise kick. The tall man crashed to the floor, his head hitting the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, he didn't move. Emma stood over him, her chest rising and falling with each steady breath, her mind still focused, still calculating the next move. But she didn't need to make one. She had won. The man was down, and the rest of the gang was either incapacitated or retreating. The cafe fell into an eerie silence. Emma glanced around, ensuring the danger had passed. The remaining patrons were staring in shock, too afraid to speak, too afraid to make a move. But Emma wasn't afraid. She couldn't afford to be. Her eyes flicked to the door as the last of the men, the one with the neck tattoo, struggled to get to his feet. His face twisted in a mix of rage and disbelief. "You're gonna regret this," he muttered under his breath, his eyes wild. Emma narrowed her eyes, her expression hard. "Not today." As he turned and stumbled toward the door, Emma didn't take her eyes off him. She could feel the weight of the moment, how close she had come to losing everything she had built. But it wasn't over yet. She couldn't let her guard down. Not with these men. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Emma knew that backup was on the way. Reyes and his team would be there soon, ready to pick up the pieces of the wreckage these men had caused. But Emma didn't need them to finish this. She had already fought back, and she had won. The man with the neck tattoo reached the door and paused, his hand resting on the frame. He turned back to look at Emma one last time, his eyes burning with fury. "You think you've won, huh?" he sneered, his voice thick with venom. "You don't know what's coming next. We'll be back. You can count on it." Emma took a step forward, her posture steady. "No, you won't," she said, her voice steady but laced with certainty. "This ends now. Get out." For a moment, the man's glare hardened, but then he turned, walking out of the cafe without another word. The door slammed behind him, and the room fell completely still. Emma stood in the middle of the cafe, her chest still heaving with the remnants of adrenaline. The silence stretched on, but in her mind, she was already planning her next move. She had won this battle, but she knew the war was far from over. The cafe was quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. Emma stood near the counter, her hands gripped tightly on the edge, her mind racing. The fight was over for now, but the lingering threat of what was to come felt like a shadow in the room. The man had left, but his words echoed in her mind. "We'll be back." Emma couldn't afford to relax, not yet. The gang had made their move, but they weren't done. She knew that. They would regroup, make their plans, and try again. But this time, Emma would be ready. She had always prided herself on keeping a calm exterior, on being the steady force that everyone in Clearwater could rely on. But now, as she stood in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, she couldn't ignore the growing tension in her chest. She wasn't just defending a cafe anymore. She was defending her future, the safety of her daughter, and the very fabric of the community she had worked so hard to build. Her phone buzzed suddenly, the sound cutting through the silence like a jolt. Emma glanced down at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the name, Detective Reyes. Without hesitation, she picked it up. "Emma," Reyes's voice came through, steady but with an edge of concern. "You okay?" "I'm fine," Emma replied, her tone calm but strained. "The cafe's a mess, but I'm fine. They've left." "I figured, but I need to warn you," Reyes said, his voice lowering, a more serious tone now. "Red's crew, they're planning something bigger. We've been tracking them for a while now, but they're escalating. They've targeted other small businesses like yours before, ones that stand in their way. And I don't want them to think they've got you cornered." Emma's heart sank. She had known this wouldn't be over quickly, but hearing it from Reyes made it real. "What do I do?" "You keep doing what you're doing," Reyes replied firmly. "You keep fighting, but be careful. I'm working on getting something solid, but they've been careful, too careful. They've covered their tracks well." "Do we have anything?" Emma asked, her voice sharp with urgency. I can't just wait around and let them make their move. We've got some leads. Morales' guy is rattling. I'm getting a team to follow up. But I need you to stay sharp. They're not just going to fold. They'll get desperate. And when people like Red get desperate, they make mistakes. Emma's pulse quickened. She was no stranger to danger. But this was different. This wasn't a mission where she could control every move. She wasn't in the field anymore. She was a mother, a business owner, and the stakes were higher now. I'll stay alert, she promised. Let me know what you need from me. Reyes paused for a moment, then added, I'll keep you posted. But Emma, don't face them alone if you can help it. This could get ugly. I've got this, Emma said, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. She didn't want to admit that she might need help, but deep down she knew she had to be smarter about this. Her family depended on it. As she ended the call, Emma looked around the cafe, her eyes scanning the damage, the overturned chairs, the broken glass. The disarray that the gang had left behind was a visible reminder of the battle she had just fought. But it was also a reminder of what she stood to lose. She wasn't going to let them win. She had fought for too long to build this life. The community had supported her, and now it was her turn to fight for them. But first, she had to deal with the aftermath. Emma spent the rest of the day cleaning up the cafe, scrubbing away the remnants of the attack. The glass had been swept up, the chairs righted, and the counters wiped clean. But despite the physical work, her mind was far from at ease. She couldn't stop thinking about what Reyes had said. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Sophia. I miss you, Mommy. Can I come home soon? Emma's heart ached as she read the message. She had been so focused on everything else that she hadn't taken the time to check in with her daughter. She quickly typed back a message, trying to sound as reassuring as possible. I miss you too, baby. I'm going to be okay. Just stay with Aunt Rachel for a little longer. I'll pick you up soon. She couldn't risk having Sophia around while the gang was still out there. Emma wasn't about to let her daughter become collateral damage in a war that wasn't hers to fight. She had learned that lesson long ago. Protect what matters most, no matter the cost. The door chimed again, and Emma's instincts kicked in immediately. She turned toward the entrance, expecting another customer, but this time, it wasn't anyone she recognized. A tall figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light of the evening. It was Maya, looking more serious than Emma had ever seen her. Emma, Maya said softly, stepping into the cafe. I know this is hard, but you're not alone in this. We're all behind you. Emma felt a surge of gratitude. Maya had been a constant presence in the cafe, someone who had become more like family than just a customer. I know, Emma replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but it feels like a battle I can't win. You're already winning, Maya said, her voice strong and unwavering. You don't have to do this alone. You have us. For the first time that day, Emma allowed herself to relax just a little. She wasn't alone in this fight, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The following days felt like they stretched on endlessly. Emma continued to put one foot in front of the other, keeping the cafe open, maintaining a semblance of normalcy for the community. The gang's attack had shaken her, but the people who came into the cafe every day kept her grounded. Their smiles, their stories, the quiet hum of conversations over coffee. It was all she needed to remind her that the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But the truth was, Emma was tired. Tired in a way she hadn't been in years. The constant vigilance, the worry for her daughter's safety, and the looming threat of Red and his gang, it was wearing on her. And though she did her best to mask it, Maya saw through the facade. You need a break, Em, Maya said one evening as the cafe began to slow down. You've been going non-stop since the attack. When's the last time you got some real rest? Emma wiped down the counter, her movements automatic as she considered Maya's words. She hadn't had time to think about rest. There was always something to do, always another threat to be prepared for, another problem to solve. But as she looked at Maya, standing there with genuine concern in her eyes, Emma realized that Maya was right. I can't let my guard down. Not yet, Emma replied, her voice quiet but resolute. I've got too much at stake. Maya stepped forward, gently taking the cloth from Emma's hands and setting it down. You're strong, but you're human, Em. You can't keep running on empty. If you keep pushing yourself like this, you won't be able to protect anything, or anyone. Emma sighed and leaned against the counter, her gaze drifting to the door. It was late, and the cafe was empty now except for the soft hum of the lights and the quiet clink of dishes being cleaned. I'm trying to keep it all together. I don't want anyone to see how scared I am. I can't afford to break. Maya was silent for a moment, and then she spoke in a soft, almost gentle tone. It's okay to be scared, but you can't do this alone. Let me help you. Emma shook her head, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. I don't want to drag anyone else into this. This is my fight, Maya. Maya didn't flinch. And it's your fight, yes. But that doesn't mean you have to do it all by yourself. We've got your back, Em. You've got a whole town behind you. The words hit Emma harder than she expected. She had spent so long fighting alone, building walls around herself, convinced that if she let anyone in, they'd become targets. But Maya was right. She couldn't protect this town alone. She couldn't protect Sophia alone. And the support she had from Maya, from the community, she had to accept it. I'm not used to this, Emma said, her voice quiet. But maybe I need to be. Maya smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. You don't have to do it all at once. Just take one step at a time. The morning light filtered softly through the cafe's windows, casting a golden glow over the freshly wiped tables and counters. Emma stood at the window, watching the people walk by on the quiet street, their faces warm and familiar. This was her town, and no one, not Red, not his gang, was going to take it from her. But there was still a lingering unease in the back of her mind, one she couldn't shake. She had been waiting for something, a call, a visit, another sign that Red was coming. It wasn't long before she heard the telltale sound of tires crunching on gravel outside the cafe. Emma's instincts flared, and she turned, her heart skipping a beat. A sleek black car slowly rolled to a stop in front of the cafe. Emma's eyes narrowed as the engine cut off, the silence heavy in the air. She felt a tightening in her chest. It wasn't the same car from before. This one was different, too clean, too precise. The door to the car opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, his suit crisp and tailored, his face obscured by a pair of dark sunglasses. Emma's pulse quickened. This wasn't one of Red's typical thugs. This was someone different. The man adjusted his sunglasses as he walked toward the door of the cafe, his stride confident, purposeful. Emma's gaze sharpened. Something told her this was the beginning of something much bigger. As the man entered, he paused for a moment, scanning the room. His eyes flicked to Emma, and she could see the cold calculation in them. He wasn't here for coffee. He was here for something else. Morning, he said, his voice low and smooth. He had a kind of presence that made her feel as though he was used to getting exactly what he wanted. Emma, is it? She stood tall, forcing a smile even as her mind raced. It's Emma. What can I do for you? He smiled, but it was thin, devoid of warmth. I was hoping we could have a conversation. You've been causing quite a stir around here. Emma narrowed her eyes, her instincts kicking in. I don't know what you're talking about. The man's lips curved into a sly smile. Don't play coy with me, Emma. We both know what's been happening in this town, and I'm here to make sure we can keep things peaceful. The man's presence was suffocating, and Emma could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. He wasn't here for pleasantries. He wasn't here to be reasonable. This was a power play. I'm not interested in whatever you're selling, Emma said firmly, her voice unwavering. He chuckled softly, an almost predatory sound. Oh, I think you will be. You see, the thing is, people like you think you can stand up to Red, but you're in over your head. If you keep poking the hornet's nest, it's not just you that's going to get stung. The words hit her like a blow to the gut. She knew what he was threatening. He wasn't talking about her cafe. He was talking about her daughter, about everyone she loved. Emma stood her ground. I'm not afraid of you or your boss, and I won't back down. The man's smile faltered for a moment, but only for a moment. I think you will. You don't have a choice. Red will make sure of that. The man's words lingered in the air long after he had left. Emma stood behind the counter, her mind racing. He hadn't been threatening her directly. No, his words had been veiled in that smooth, almost conversational tone. But the meaning was clear. Red and his crew were coming for her. And this time, They wouldn't stop until they had her cornered. She wiped down the counter absently, her hands moving through the motions without thought. The weight of the conversation with the stranger weighed heavily on her. He wasn't just trying to intimidate her, he was testing her, pushing her to see how far she'd go, how much she could take. And Emma knew deep down that this was just the beginning. That afternoon, the cafe had emptied out by the time the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows. A sense of calm settled over the room, but it was an uneasy calm, the kind that often precedes a storm. Emma had dealt with danger before, on missions, intense situations that demanded immediate action. But this was different. This wasn't a mission she could control. This wasn't a battle where the enemy's movements were predictable. This was real life, her life. Her daughter was safe for now, staying with Aunt Rachel. But Emma couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was about to happen. The gang was moving, and she was running out of time to prepare. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Reyes. "We got a lead. Red's planning something. I need you to meet me at the warehouse tonight. I'll brief you then. Stay sharp." Emma exhaled sharply, her pulse quickening. It wasn't a surprise, but hearing it from Reyes made it feel real. She grabbed her jacket, feeling the cool fabric slide over her shoulders, and started to close up the cafe. That evening, Emma arrived at the old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was quiet, too quiet. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered above, casting long shadows on the cracked concrete floor. It was an industrial place, long past its prime, but perfect for the kind of shady deals Red and his crew liked to conduct. Emma stood outside for a moment, gathering her bearings, and then she pushed open the rusted door, the creak of metal loud in the silence. Inside, Reyes stood near the center of the room, his back to her. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid. He had been in the business long enough to know when things were about to get ugly. "You made it," Reyes said, his voice low but serious. "We're close. This is it." Emma nodded, her heart pounding. "What are we walking into?" "Red's not here yet," Reyes said, motioning to the shadows. "But his crew's already inside. We're ready. I've got backup waiting, but we need to move fast." Emma's eyes scanned the room. There was something tense in the air, the feeling of a trap being set. But she didn't hesitate. This was her chance. If Red's crew was going to make their move, she had to make sure they didn't walk away from this unscathed. Reyes handed her a small earpiece, his fingers brushing against hers. "Stay close to me. We've got to keep them off balance." Emma nodded, slipping the earpiece into her ear and adjusting it. "What's the plan?" "We move in first," Reyes said, his voice low and focused. "We corner them. Make sure they don't get away." A faint sound of footsteps echoed from behind, and Emma's instincts went on high alert. She quickly turned, scanning the darkness. Then a voice called out, cutting through the silence. "You're late," said the man who had spoken to her in the cafe, Victor, the smooth-talking enforcer who had delivered the warning just days earlier. Emma's heart skipped. He was the one who had been sent to get her to back down, and now it seemed like the entire gang had shown up, ready to deal the final blow. Victor stepped into the dim light, his smirk wide and unrepentant. "I warned you, didn't I? You just don't know when to quit, Emma." Emma's eyes narrowed, her hand instinctively reaching for the weapon tucked in the waistband of her jeans. "I don't quit," she said, her voice steady but sharp, "and neither do the people I care about." Victor laughed, his eyes flicking over to Reyes. "This town's been a thorn in Red's side for too long. It's time for that to end." Emma felt a ripple of unease, but she wasn't about to back down. She had been through worse. "If you think you can intimidate me, you're mistaken," she said. Victor's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered, glancing toward his men who had slowly started to circle the room. "I'm not here to intimidate. I'm here to end this. You, your cafe, your little rebellion, it's all over." A flash of movement caught Emma's eye. One of Victor's men was moving toward her. In an instant, she was ready. She didn't think. She acted. Before the man could get within arm's reach, Emma stepped forward, her body fluid and quick. She slammed her fist into his stomach, knocking the air out of him. He crumpled to the ground with a grunt, but before he could get back up, Emma grabbed his wrist, twisting it painfully behind his back. "Stay down," she said, her voice calm but firm. Victor's eyes narrowed, a flicker of annoyance flashing across his face. "You think you can fight us all off? You really believe you can stop us? Emma straightened, keeping her eyes locked on him. You're going to need more than threats to take me down. Victor's jaw tightened. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But they won't save you. Emma took a step forward, her body poised for the next move. The tension in the room was palpable. Victor's men were closing in, and Emma could see the flickers of uncertainty in their eyes. They had expected to intimidate her, to make her break. But Emma was resolute. This wasn't just a cafe to her. This was her life, her town, and her daughter's future. You're outnumbered, Victor said, his voice low. This is over. Emma shook her head, her grip tightening on her knife. Not yet. The tension in the warehouse was suffocating. Emma's breath was steady, her mind sharp, even as her muscles screamed with fatigue. The smell of sweat and dust filled the air, mixing with the faint metallic tang of blood from the earlier scuffle. She was still on her feet, still in control, but she knew the clock was ticking. Red and his men were closing in, and every move they made felt like it could be the last. Victor's smirk had faltered when Emma knocked his man to the ground, but it quickly returned. He signaled to his crew, and they all closed in, surrounding her and Reyes. You think you've won? Victor sneered, his voice sharp with disdain. This is just the beginning. Red's not the type to let things slide. Emma's eyes flicked to Reyes, who had his gun drawn, but his expression was calm. We don't need to fight anymore. You're already surrounded. Victor's eyes darted to his men, and for the first time a flicker of doubt crossed his face. They had expected a simple confrontation, but now things had escalated. They hadn't anticipated Emma's resistance or the backup Reyes had planned. You're wrong, Victor, Emma said, her voice calm but firm. It's already over. You're done. Victor's expression twisted with fury. You don't know who you're dealing with. Before Emma could respond, one of Victor's men lunged at her, his hand reaching for her throat, but she was ready. With swift precision, Emma sidestepped his attack and grabbed a loose pipe from the ground. She swung it upward, knocking his weapon from his hand. The man staggered back, clutching his wrist in pain. Reyes fired a shot into the air, a clear warning to anyone thinking of advancing. This ends now, he commanded, but Victor wasn't ready to give up. He charged at Emma with a roar, the cold determination in his eyes a reflection of the man he followed. Emma's heart pounded as she prepared for the final confrontation. Victor swung a crowbar with all his strength, but Emma was faster. She ducked under the swing, her muscles coiled for the next move. She grabbed the crowbar mid-swing, twisting it out of his hands and throwing it to the side. Victor's eyes widened in disbelief as he found himself disarmed. I told you, Emma said, her voice firm. You're done. Victor's breathing was heavy now, his posture defensive. He was cornered, and he knew it. But instead of backing down, he lunged at Emma one last time, desperation clear in his actions. Emma wasn't about to let him take her down. With one final burst of strength, she threw a punch that sent him sprawling to the ground. He gasped for air, the fight draining from him. She stood over him, her chest rising and falling with exertion, but she was still standing tall. Reyes stepped forward, his voice steady. Victor, it's over. You're under arrest for multiple charges, including assault, extortion, and hate crimes. Your crew is done. Victor's eyes flicked to his men, but none of them moved. The gang had been defeated, their confidence shattered by Emma's resistance and the tactical precision of Reyes' team. They knew they had lost. You're not going to get away with this, Victor spat, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Emma leaned down, meeting his gaze. I'm not the one who's going to prison. You are. With that, the backup officers moved in, securing Victor and the rest of his crew. They were arrested without resistance, their reign of terror over. The sound of handcuffs snapping into place echoed in the silence of the warehouse. The next few days were a blur. The cafe was repaired, the broken windows replaced, and the graffitied walls scrubbed clean. The community rallied together, helping Emma rebuild what had been torn down. It wasn't just about the cafe anymore. It was about the people who depended on it, the families who found solace in its walls, and the new bond that had formed between Emma and her neighbors. On the morning of the trial, Emma stood on the courthouse steps, watching as the news cameras flashed. It wasn't a victory for her alone. It was a victory for the entire town. Red and his crew had been sentenced, and the town could finally breathe again. Detective Reyes stood beside her, his expression serious but respectful. "You did it, Emma. You saved this town." Emma didn't answer immediately. She just watched as the reporters swarmed around the courthouse, capturing every moment. The town had fought back, and now they had their future back. "You didn't do this alone, you know," Reyes added, his voice softening. Emma turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. "I know, but it was worth it." As the day unfolded, Emma made her way to the cafe, her steps slower now. She felt lighter, as if the weight of the past few weeks had been lifted from her shoulders. When she walked into the cafe, it was filled with familiar faces. The cafe was busy again, but this time, it felt different. It felt like home. Sophia's voice called out from the back of the cafe. "Mom, you're home!" Emma turned, her heart swelling with emotion as her daughter ran toward her. She scooped Sophia into her arms, holding her tightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma felt peace. The community had survived, and so had she. A few weeks later, Emma sat in the quiet corner of the cafe, a cup of coffee in hand. Her thoughts wandered, but she wasn't afraid anymore. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. The town had come together, and Emma had found something she hadn't realized she was missing: strength and unity. As Sophia sat across from her, coloring in her notebook, Emma couldn't help but smile. The world around them was changing, but Emma was ready for it. She had built something stronger than fear, something that couldn't be destroyed, and it was hers to protect. The cafe, her town, and most importantly, her family.